Hello, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor and pleasure to be here for our third event, which I organized somehow. And I will, actually, my role here is more to change slides and to, announce speakers and musician. So we will start with music and we will end with music. Let me turn on the slide. Okay. This is my, again, honor to introduce Mikhail Murach, who is a pianist. He was trained at Conservatoire in Moscow under Evgeny Liberman and Vera Gornostaeva. Murach has been with Dutch National Ballet since 1989, but he has also had a successful career outside the company. He has performed with orchestras and given recitals in Germany, England, Finland, Austria, Italy, Yugoslavia, Greece, United States, Canada, and India even. He has also accompanied some famous violinists and cellists at Concertgebouw in Amsterdam. So we will start with 7 short preludes by Alexander Scriabin. And at the end, Mikhail will play one piece of Tchaikovsky from 4 Seasons, and 2 pieces of Sergei Prokofiev. So let us welcome Mikhail, please. One of the preludes by Scriabin was composed in Amsterdam. Prelude, the 3rd one in the out of 7.
front pages.
While there are more people coming, Misha told me that last time he played pianino instead of great piano was in mid-80s in North Kazakhstan. But I think he managed pretty well. So let me now turn to the main topic of our today's evening, which is Russian poetry in exile. And to the right from me is Dmirty Vedenyapin, the poet and friend who lives in Paris for already four years, I guess. And Dmitry was born in Moscow in 1959, graduated from the Moscow Institute of Foreign Languages. He worked as a night guard, a casual worker in geological and archaeological expeditions, a sambo, which is Russian kind of judo coach, a juggler. There are recordings on YouTube. Dmitry juggling with I don't know how many pieces, but five. So, okay. So an English teacher, a lecturer on Russian literature, a translator. He's an author of 10 books of poetry, and he started writing poetry when he was about 17 years old, and he won a number of literary prizes, which are listed on the screen. And he will talk tonight about Russian poetry in exile, and specifically about Vladislav Khodasevich, one of the key figures of Russian immigration literature, along with Bunin, Nabokov, but those names are more recognized in the West because they wrote prose. And Dmitry will speak about Khodasevich. And to the left of me is Otto Boele, a senior lecturer in Russian studies from University of Leiden, and his main research interests. Yeah, let me switch the slide. Hold on. Yeah, here is Otto. Tolstoy, Fin de siècle, thank you. Silver Age of Russian Poetry, Russian Cinema, and here we have a list of his main publications. And these two gentlemen will We'll have a dialogue after Dmitry will have his presentation, actually. So let's welcome Dmitry and...
Well, can you hear me? Yes, okay, great. Well, good evening, everyone, and I also feel very privileged and honored to be here tonight, and also I feel quite puzzled because to introduce Vladislav Khadasevich to you in about 30 minutes is a really hard task. But, well, I'll try to do something. And of course, thank you, Maxim, for inviting me and arranging this event. Okay, so, well, I believe that I have to start a conversation, a talk about a poet. Well, the right thing is to give you some kind of example of his poetry, right? So, I'll read now a short poem by Vladislav Khadasevich, and then I'll give you, well, some kind of brief comment on that. So, yeah, pardon? Yeah, it is my poem. Well, it's also very good, but probably it's not the right thing. For the time being, we'd better focus on Khadasevich. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm ready to read my, well, yeah, that's him, but we'd better start with the poem, okay?
Okay.
So next slide. Here we are. Yeah, that's correct. Okay, so, and I'm going to read it in Russian, of course, in the original, so that you can listen to this music and, again, have some idea how it sounds. Перешагни, перескочи, перелети, что хочешь, но вырвись, камнем из прощи, звездой, сорвавшейся в ночи, сам затерял, теперь ищи. Бог знает, что себе бормочешь, ища пенсне или ключи. And now I'll read it in English, or shall I read it in English? Yeah, I think so. Okay. So, of course, it's just a word after word translation, but still, it gives you some idea. Step over, jump over, fly over, cross, however you like, but break loose, like a stone from a sling, like a star falling in the night. You lost it yourself, now look for it. God knows what you mumble to yourself, looking for the pince-nez or the keys. So, well, in Russian, believe me, it's very, very nicely structured. You know, and I'd like to draw your attention to these two dates. You know, here there are just 7 lines, but yes, it took Khadasevich, well, more than a year, actually, to finish this poem, which is very typical of him, by the way. Now, look here. There are some tricks, I mean, connected with rhyming, with rhymes here. Перешагни, перескочи, перелети, что хочешь. Then, you know, comes the third line. Но вырвись камнем из прощи. So, and look, the word in the first line, skachi, and this prashi, well, sounds almost like a rhyme for a Russian ear. So that's what you think. Okay, this is the rhyme, and it's a usual rhyme structure, right? When the first line rhymes with the third line. But then comes the fourth line. Звездой, сорвавшейся в ночи. So, перескочи, ночи, that is the real rhyme, exact, right? And then, so now we know that we have been deceived in a way. Then comes the fifth line, that, of course, is she, rhymes with the third line, prashi. Then, which is not so typical of the Russian poetry, Barmochesh, of course, rhymes with Hochesh, so there is actually a three-line gap between Hochesh and Barmochesh. Normally, if the poem is rhymed, it's rhymed like, you know, first line, third line, second line, fourth line. But here we have this big gap, but we hear this rhyme very well. And then comes the last line. It's almost like, you know, a smile on the part of the author or a gift for us. Okay, you got my trick, right? So nachi, skachi, here is the another rhyme with this chi at the end. And, well, I mean, you know, it's like in Russian, it looks like some kind of choreography, right? Some kind of dance played with words, actually. It's really very nice. And there is this tension and then a kind of really dance-like release at the end. So in terms of, well, the content, you see that, well, actually it's an existential thing, right? How to get out of this, well, I mean, dead end, right? Cul-de-sac, a person, well, finds himself, right? And there are two voices here. Look, first, well, it's a kind of really mumbling, right? And then comes this third line, but break loose like a stone from a sling, then fourth line, like a star falling in the night. So it sounds very romantic, right? And immediately what Khadasevich does, he puts out this romantic fire, right? He silences this voice, right? And he says, right, you lost it yourself, now look for it, right? God knows what you mumble to yourself, looking for the pince-nez or the keys. So there is this understatement, very, very typical of Khadasevich, right? Because Russian poetry is very, very often about overstatement. But here you see that this, as I say, romantic fire was put out. So now, well, you see that the translation was made by David Bethe, a very good American critic who, back in 1983, wrote a book on Khadasevich, and he put it back in 1983. He said, well, Khadasevich is not a household name in the West, he said. And, well, the situation hasn't changed much, right? So I'd better tell you just briefly about his life. So he was born, Vladislav Khadasevich. Now, Maxim, if you can, yeah, that's it. So was born in 1886 in Moscow. He was the sixth son, and his father was a son of a Polish disenfranchised nobleman who fled to Russia during the Polish rebellion of 1833. So his mother was Jewish, converted into Catholicism, and she was also, from Polish-Lithuania, and well, I'm not going into it because it'll take too long, but, well, very briefly, she became an orphan, and she was adopted by a very prominent and prosperous aristocratic Polish family. And she loved Polish and Polish culture and church with all her heart. And I have to say that she passed on to her son this love for Chodasiewicz knew Polish, and and he was also a Catholic, which is a rare case for Russian poets. Was a rare case, and it is still very rare, right? So. When he was young, about 4, I think, or 5, he got very much interested in ballet. And all his youth, I have I forgot, sorry. I have to tell you one thing which is important. You know that Russian poets, have this kind of consensus. And it is still so. We think that the greatest, and maybe some people think that he was the only genius we really have in Russian literature is Pushkin. So it's a usual thing to kind of compare, right? I've heard with my own ears that, people say he's about some poets, right? He's as short as Pushkin, or he's as, ladies' man as Pushkin, or something like that. So, and Chodasiewicz, who was very much interested, later on, he became very much interested in Pushkin and research. He studied him, he wrote a number of articles about Pushkin, very good, actually. So, he wrote at some point a very nice poem devoted to his nanny. And of course, when you write in Russian context, when you write a poem and devote it to your nanny, there are some allusions there in the poem, so he's not hiding that. That, of course, we immediately remember Arina Rodionovna, famous Pushkin's nanny, right? So the point is that when Chodasiewicz was born, he was a very weak baby, and actually they were afraid that he could die because he couldn't suckle for some reason, right? And so this lady, Elena Kuzina, a simple Russian peasant, right, she managed to do this job and saved. She was his wet nurse first, and then his nanny, and she saved his life. Okay, so, but as I say, at the age of 5, or I am not sure, when he was still very young, he got very much interested in ballet. And why I'm mentioning that, because through ballet, he, as he himself said it, he came to art in general and to poetry in particular. And we can see this, traces of his love for ballet, even in that poem which I gave you at the beginning. We see it. So then, what should I say now? Yeah, that as many Russian, figures of culture, right? Poets, composers, artists, Chodasiewicz accepted the revolution of 1917 in Russia with some hope, right? But as he himself recalled later, but even, okay, by the way, I can read, Maxim, can you, next slide, please. Next. Yes, here what he says about 1917. You see, it's from Grain's Way, that is one of his three main books. Grain's Way, it is entitled. So, and there is this poem, which it's a fragment from this poem. It's about this very period, right? So too does my soul go the way of grain. Once descended into darkness, it will die and come alive again. And you, my country, and you, her people, will die and come alive, having passed through this year. Since a single wisdom is given us, every living thing must go the way of grain. So that was his hope. But, as I say, quite soon he realized, first that literary activity under the Bolsheviks was impossible. He realized it very soon, and by 1922, he decided that it was time actually to leave Russia, which he did with his third wife, Nina Berberova. You can show probably this, yes, picture of, that's her. That is his third wife. Yes, they emigrated together in 1922 to Berlin. Well, I have to say that Khadasevich, like many Russian emigre writers, and not just writers, Russian people who left Russia at the time, he hoped to come back. He didn't mean to emigrate, actually. So they lived in, like many people, in one of his poems, Khadasevich called Berlin a stepmother of Russian towns. And yes, he was, like, as I say, many people in a state of limbo, between here and there. By 1923, many Russian writers have come back to Russia, but Khadasevich and Berberova, started their gypsy-like existence in the West. So just for you to understand their way of life, at the time, they, in 3 years, during this period, they lived in 42 different rooms. And they lived in London, in Rome, in Marienbad, you name them, right? So in every town and city of Europe, almost. So in 1925, they came back to Paris and settled down there, and where Khadasevich lived till his sudden death in 1939. He died of cancer at the age of 53. All his life, he was quite poor. The first years, actually, at the verge of starvation, but finally he got this position of a critic of the head of the literary section in one of the main emigre newspapers of the time, and so his position became, not so bad financially, but as I say, still he never was rich or even close to that. No, not at all. So now, Maxim, can you show this other poem, which, yes. Next. Yes, no, next, please. Next. Yes, here we are. So, look here. I'm going, again, for you to feel, right, what kind of poet he was and what actually, what idea of what it is to be a creative, figure he had. I'd like to comment, well, first I'm going to read it, then I'll comment. So, I believe, do I have 5 more minutes? Or yeah, is that okay? So, I'm going to read it again in Russian, then in English. So, вот в этом палаце жила Дездемона. Все это неправда, но стыдно смеяться. Смотри, как стоят за колонной колонна вот в этом палаце. Вдали зачихает вечерняя пьяцца, беззвучно вращается свод небосклона, расшитый звездами, как шапка паяца. Минувшая мальчик, упавший с балкона. Того, что настанет, не нужно касаться. Быть может, и правда жила Дездемона вот в этом палаце. Here in this palazzo lived Desdemona. It's all made up, but to laugh would be wrong. Look at how one column stands behind another here in this palazzo. In the distance, the evening piazza is quieting down, and the vault of the sky revolves silently, embroidered with stars like a jester's cap. The past is a boy who fell from a balcony. What comes after should not be touched. Perhaps it is true, and Desdemona really lived in this palazzo. So, we see that, well, in terms of form, it is some derivative of, as you see, rondo and sonnet, something like that. And, maybe you can't see that looking at this text, but in the original it is so. But now I have I'd like to comment on this. Again, you can probably understand Radasevich better through that. Look, so the first line, here in this palazzo lived Desdemona. Who says it? I believe that it is said by a guide or somebody like a guide, right? And there is this group of people, and of course, we are in this group, right? And of course, as always happens, we think that we are smarter than the guide, we are better read, we are better educated, and we know, right, that, well, no, come on, it's not true, right? And if we have no manners, we might even start giggling, right? But now, the author says, well, yeah, okay, it's all made up, but to laugh would be wrong. Now, it's interesting how he explains kind of why it would be wrong. It looks like almost this book of Job from the Bible, when actually, remember, right, after all these, accusations, God starts telling, well, he doesn't explain, right, anything, but he just starts telling Job, where were you when I created, hippopotamus, right, or the sea or something, right? So, and here, the author doesn't explain why we shouldn't, right, giggle, right? But he says, look at how one column stands behind another. Then he suggests that we should look at this piazza, and then look up and see these stars, right? So, what he means, of course, look at the beauty, right, of this world. Then comes this line, mysterious line, right? The past is a boy who fell from a balcony. Okay, I can tell you that, well, there is a kind of, biographical or lyrical lining behind it, because Khedasevich himself, when he was 4 or 3 years old, he almost fell out of the window, and the same nanny, saved his life once again, because she grabbed his foot, literally, and dragged him back. So, but, well, it doesn't explain much, but probably there is something. It's additional kind of piece of information. But what I think it means in this poem, that, well, okay, we don't know if this boy survived or if he was killed, right? But anyway, he is not here any longer. The boy became an adult, right? So there is no boy any longer. Then, so the past is not here, right? Then comes, and of course we don't know the future, right? Right? And we shouldn't, if we start, telling anything about the future, it's just babbling, right? And then he says, look, so we don't know the past, we don't know the future. So what we have is this very moment, right? So, and if we are in this moment, right? So, and if we see this beauty, okay, maybe after all, it is true, right? Who knows, right? And actually it doesn't matter, right? Perhaps it is, and Desdemona really lived in this palazzo, okay? So, yes, I'm afraid it's time for me to.
No, you have, yeah, go ahead. We have plenty of poetry.
Really? Really? Well, okay. We will be, I hope, yes, we'll have this conversation. Anyway, so just one thing then. Okay, let's probably, no, we'll skip this one, and can you, yes. Well, it's a poem which I love very much, and also, you can use it like an instruction, actually, how to write a poem, right? Or, again, how to find yourself in this consciousness which enables one to create something. Okay, look here. I'm going to read it again. Probably I'll read just the first stanza in Russian and then in English, right? Большие флаги над эстрадой, сидят пожарные трубя. Закрой глаза и падай, падай, как навзничь в самого себя. Big flags fly above the stage, where seated firemen are playing trumpets. Close your eyes and fall as flat on your back into yourself. The day, annoyed by the trumpet's roar and the enveloping blue of the sky, bewitch them with a single word, push them away with one motion. Roll your eyes away under your eyelids. hold the motion of your blood and inhale the darkness from some long gone past, the prenatal darkness of existence. It's not the end of the poem. Like a rider on a camel's humps, lean back with languor, freeze or else die away from here and be born into the long forgotten. Then, with renewed joy, like a mirage, in the midst of the desert, you will see the flags above the stage and hear the trumpeters' trumpets. So, yes, he just, enumerate the steps, what you should do, right? This, how you call it, I forgot the word, salto mortale, somersault. Yeah, that's right. So you should do this, right? So kind of fly, right, or jump into yourself, into the past, right, and then come back. And only in this situation, right, only in this case, you can see this, well, reality. Khadasevich, and again, you can see in this poem, this nice, I like it at least, this nice blend of symbolism and post-symbolism. Modernism and postmodernism, if you like. So there is this wonderful combination, very rare combination of irony and seriousness, depth, metaphysical depth, if you like, right? Existential depth, and at the same time, some kind of irony. Can we look at the last poem here before the mirror? Well, maybe I'm not going to read the whole thing, but again, just two probably stanzas. I. What a weird word. If that man there really I, can I be that mother loved such, can it be that mother loved such a person, grayish yellow, with hair turning gray, and omniscient as a serpent? And so on and so forth. And here, I suggest, of course, that I hope that you will be reading Khadasevich after this event. There are some translations, of course, into English, and I believe into Dutch as well. Right. And one more thing, the last thing I'm going to tell you now. As you see, his kind of prosodic profile is quite classical, or at least it looks like that, right? He uses rhymes, he uses meter, and so on and so forth. But believe me, it's so up to date, it's so fresh that, though most of these poems were written almost one or sometimes more than 100 years ago, right? You read them today as if they were written yesterday, really. And because, yes, as I say, of this combination of black humor, irony, and real depth. In Russia, There are still, I don't know, well, it's probably the topic for our conversation later. So I'm not sure that these arguments are still so heated in the Netherlands, but in Russia, they're still on. I mean, they're going on and on. The arguments between the so-called traditionalists or conservatives, right, and the so-called avant-gardists or innovators and so on. And because Khadasevich used this, well, meter system and so on and so forth, he's labeled as a conservative. And now and that will be the last thing I'm going to tell you today, well, in this presentation at least, right? That's what he says about literary conservative and generally about literature and poetry. That's what he says. The spirit of literature is the spirit of eternal explosion and eternal renewal. Thus, literary conservatism has nothing in common with literary reaction. The literary conservative is an eternal instigator, the keeper of the fire, not the one to put it out. Okay, thank you so much for your attention.
Okay, now that we have familiarized ourselves with Khadasevich the poet, I'm gonna talk a little bit about Khadasevich the prose writer. Khadasevich didn't produce any fictional prose, at least not to my knowledge, but as a prose writer he has a very solid reputation because he's mainly remembered for two books, a biography of Gavrila Derzhavin, who was an 18th century poet, but particularly for his memoirs, Necropolis, memoirs which were published just a month before he died in 1939. And the reason I want to talk a little bit about these memoirs is that it is the only really substantial text of Khadasevich that is available to the non-Russian reader. It's been translated into several languages, into English and also into Dutch. As you can see, these are the English and the Dutch translation. The Dutch translation is from 1987 and was published in this famous series, Privédomein, by the Arbeiderspers, which is still being published, I think, and is considered a quite prestigious series. So it's the only real publication of Khadasevich's work in Dutch, but it's it was published in a very solid series, and I think that is very deserved. So it's a substantial text that that you can actually read in Dutch translation. But the other thing is that his memoirs are generally regarded not just as a fairly reliable source of information on the literary scene of the early 20th century, but it is really a very captivating analysis of the zeitgeist, of the mentality of those of that period, especially of the mentality of the symbolist poets with whom Khadasevich was very close at the beginning of his career. As a matter of fact, he started out as a symbolist poet himself. So his memoirs, which have this gloomy title, Necropolis, present us with a very entertaining, a very sometimes very hilarious and sometimes very moving portrait of description of literary life in Russia just before and during the Revolution and the Civil War. So just from a historical point of view, it's really a must-read, I would say. Now, within the context of literary history, the first 2 decades of the 20th century are often referred to as the Silver Age of Russian poetry. I mean, that's one of the first pieces of information as a student of Russian literature that you are required to appropriate. The Silver Age of Russian poetry, of course, the Golden Age of Russian poetry is the time of Alexander Pushkin, the 1820s and 1830s, roughly. But more in general, the early 20th century, of course, is a time when the arts really flourished in Russia, not only in literature or the pictorial arts. Think of the composers that were active at the time. Stravinsky, Scriabin, Prokofiev was just emerging, Rachmaninoff. And of course, Sergei Diaghilev was causing a sensation in Western Europe with his Ballet Russe. So everybody kind of agrees that the early 20th century in Russia was really one of the finest periods in the history of Russian high culture. And I would say that the international prestige of Russian culture still very much rests on this period, on these first two and a half decades at the start of the 20th century. But interestingly enough, this whole idea that Russia was really experiencing an artistic, a literary revival, a renaissance, that idea in itself came much later into being. The expression the Silver Age, of course, was not used at the time. That's always what happens with these labels and these forms of periodization. They were only invented afterward. And the expression was coined towards the end of the 1930s among Russian immigrants who were becoming increasingly aware of the fact that they would never return to Russia. At first they had their hopes that at some point they could return to Russia, including Kharasevich when he left the country in 1922. But towards the end of the 1930s, it was apparent that the Bolsheviks were not going to leave, and this caused these immigrants to look back at the Russia they had left behind, that they knew, in an increasingly nostalgic way. So this is only when this whole idea comes about that, hey, we were experiencing a renaissance, and that is, that was a time when a Russia existed that is now irretrievably lost. Now, if you go back to the time itself, so the early 20th century, then you see that Russian intellectuals were far more critical of the era they lived in. So whatever they were hoping for, whether it was the radiant future of communism or a peasant's utopia, liberal democracy, or the apocalypse, the idea that we are living in an old, morally corrupt world that is about to disappear, that will cease to exist, some seismic changes will take place. That was a very common feeling shared by a lot of different intellectuals, but particularly by the symbolists, who were convinced that through their art they would play a significant role in this whole process. They would somehow help humanity enter a completely new historical era. Now, as I said, Kharasevich started out as a symbolist himself, and yet he was 6 years younger than the main symbolist poets, Alexander Blok and Andrei Balie, who we see there to the left, and then to his right is Alexander Blok, and Kharasevich was much younger than the founding father of the movement, Valery Brusov, who we see the low row in the middle. So all in all, Kharasevich was admiring the symbolists and he was close to them, but at the same time he remained a bit of an outsider. And probably because of that, he was less susceptible to these completely idealistic ideas about the transformative power of art. And that's something that the symbolist really believed in. So yes, he's close to the symbolists, he admires them. On the other hand, especially in hindsight, in his memoirs, he also is aware of the destructiveness of their philosophy, how this philosophy impacts on their personal lives and how it destroys these lives. Because these symbolists have these completely unrealistic hopes, high hopes about what their art would achieve. And here I would like to quote Kharasevich, who puts it very succinctly in this quote. He says about the symbolist, the symbolist had no desire to separate the writer from the human being, the literary from the personal biography. Symbolism was not content to be merely an artistic school, a literary movement. It was constantly striving to become a means of life creation. Now, this term, life creation, is quite complicated, but I will say two things about it. Life creation is a term that refers to a tendency among these symbolists to treat art not as art, but as a form as a means to transform reality. And it also refers to these symbolist inclinations to fashion their lives as if it were a piece of art, right? So when you're a symbolist poet, you are a symbolist poet 24/7, which means that whatever poems you write, whatever erotic adventures you engage in, it's all part of this great piece of art that you are together with the poetry that you write. It's a sort of a package that refers both to yourself, to your personality, and to the art that you produce. Now, of course, these are all mind-boggling concepts, but this is the categories in which the symbolists were thinking. So very idealistic, unrealistic, I would say. So this is the environment that Kharasevich worked in, lived in during the early stage of his career, and yet he retained a certain aloofness. At least this is how he presents himself in his memoirs. So he's an admiring outsider, but an outsider nonetheless. Now, what kind of book is Necropolis? And since it's Kharasevich's memoirs, how personal a document is it? Now, in translation, the Necropolis varies a bit. It depends on the choices that were made by the Dutch and the English publisher. If we stick to the Dutch translation, it contains a few chapters on Kharasevich himself, on his childhood, on his youth, in which he describes his dreams about becoming a ballet dancer and how he had to abandon these dreams because of his poor health. But it also contains some very funny descriptions of the emerging literary bureaucracy of Soviet Russia, and his encounters with the People's Commissar of Culture and Education, Anatoly Lunacharsky. But the bulk of it consists of very lively, very engagingly written portraits of some of the key figures of literary life in the early 20th century. Balie, Nikolai Gumilyov, Brusov, Maxim Gorky, with whom he worked closely together in emigration. But he also writes, and these chapters are perhaps even more interesting, he also writes about lesser-known figures who, in Kharasevich's opinion, exemplified the zeitgeist of fin de siècle Russia. So Samuel Kisin, Viktor Goffman, Nina Petrovskaya. Now these names probably don't say anything to you, and they are minor poets who are forgotten and perhaps deservedly so. But Kharasevich knew them very well, and he regarded their fate as very symptomatic of the time of this time of the early 20th century. So they were all high-strung, idealistic individuals, who ultimately proved incapable of living up to the unrealistic high hopes that they had about what they would achieve with their arts. And these three individuals all committed suicide. And Kharasevich presents this as, as a symptom of the time of this early 20th century. So that, of course, explains the title of his memoirs. It's all about people who, at the time he wrote about them, had already died, but it's also a tribute, in a way, an ambivalent tribute to a time, a world pre-revolutionary Russia that was irretrievably lost. Now, I want to conclude with a poem by Kharasevich, which is a personal favorite. And the reason I want to cite this is because it's kind of, in poetry, illustrates what I perceive as Kharasevich mentality, or the way he perceived life. And to do that, I will just read two quotes by Michael Wachtel, who's probably one of the greatest experts on Russian poetry, and he defines the key to Kharasevich poetry as follows. Kharasevich poetic greatness lies in his untiring and at times heroic quest to find meaning in the world, or, to borrow one of his own images, to discern poetry in the prose of life. At times this search ends in failure and is accompanied by bitter irony. At other times, an epiphanic moment comes as a surprise to the poet himself. Throughout, the poet is a solitary figure navigating an unsympathetic and even hostile world. The speaker of Kharasevich poetry may wish to disregard the pettiness and ugliness of his surroundings in favor of the transcendent. This is, of course, what a symbolist poet would strive after, but this is simply not possible in Kharasevich's case. Kharasevich records the mundane with painterly precision. His method is metonymic. He focuses on a single telling detail rather than sketching a scene in broad strokes. And to illustrate that, I will read a poem, and you can read the English translation simultaneously. I think a very good translation by Peter Daniel. So here it comes. Висел он, не качаясь, на узком ремешке, свалившаяся шляпа чернела на песке. В ладонь впивались ногти на стиснутой руке. А солнце восходило, стремя к полудню бег, и перед этим солнцем, не опуская век, был высоко приподнят на воздух человек. И зорко, зорко, зорко смотрел на восток. Внизу столпились люди в притихнувший кружок. И был почти не виден тот узкий ремешок. So, I think the poem illustrates very well two characteristic features of Kharasevich's poetry that Michael Wachtel mentions, irony and focus on a single telling detail. So right in the first stanza, we are presented with the gruesome sight of a man who's hung himself, presumably at night. Now it gets light. Passers-by walk through the park, discover this man hanging on this slender band. So the situation itself seems obvious enough. But then Kharasevich gives an ironic twist to it. The people clustering around the man, cannot really see this slender band on which he is hanging. And as a result of it, it appears that he's hovering, he's floating above the ground, as if he has released himself from the earth, as if he's a sort of a spiritually superior being who can, who can transcend the gravity. And it's also interesting that this man is staring in eastern direction. He's staring at the east. And that creates the impression of a prophet almost, who's surrounded by his disciples, those people surrounding him, and eager to take every word in that he will speak. But of course, he's dead and he will speak no more. So now it's tempting to conclude from this poem that it signals Kharasevich overcoming of his earlier symbolist leanings. But it's definitely the case that the poem was inspired by a very event event that Kharasevich was witnessing 2 years earlier. And this is often the case with Kharasevich poetry, that there is some detail that he actually witnessed, that he actually encountered, and that formed the basis of a poem that sometimes worked for years on to turn it into a poet. Okay, I think it's certainly an illustration of his ability to discover the poetry in the prose of life, and this is why I wanted to share this poem with you. And I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
So now you may
Talk.
Yes, okay. So now we're gonna talk.
Okay.
Okay, now I'll start by saying, Dmitry, I was really confused by your talk. And
What do you mean?
well, no, I'm joking. I liked it very much, but
Yeah. Okay.
okay. Let's start with the reason we talk about Kharasevich is not because he deserves to be talked about and he deserves to be read, but since he was an immigrant, he one of the main figureheads of Russian literature in exile. I think, given the situation we're in now, with so many Russian intellectuals and people with higher education leaving the country, it's obvious that we seem to be in some kind of a similar situation, although we don't know how it will play out in the end. But this is one of the reasons why we chose to talk about Kharasevich. Dmitry, could you tell us a little bit about your personal connection with Kharasevich? I mean, is he a personal favorite of yours? When did you read him for the first time? In Soviet time, he was not readily available. Or was he?
No, he wasn't. He wasn't. But I can tell you that, like most of my coevals, I got acquainted with him in the early 80s. When I say my coevals, I mean, of course, a certain group of, young people who were interested in literature, in poetry, belonged to the so-called intelligentsia, right, which we were very proud of at the time. And the borders were closed, of course, right? No Kharasevich, no books, nothing. But though the borders were closed, they were not impenetrable, actually. So by different, loopholes, backdoors, his poems reached us in the early 80s. which was quite late, actually, because, of course, well, you know, Mandelstam, Pasternak, and even Zabolotsky, right, and Harms were already, I mean, read by that time. And Khadasevich, Georgy Ivanov, and other emigre writers, well, started, you know, coming to us at the time. And when I first read Khadasevich, I was absolutely stunned, you know, by first, well, you know, I have to tell you, probably it might be interesting for you, that at that time, well, well, I would say, well, I wasn't unique in this respect. I mean, we believed, you know, now I think that it was actually an illusion on our part. But we believed that, well, first of all, we, of course, thought that pre-revolutionary culture was just absolutely wonderful. You know, we have this image of our Russian culture before the revolution, something perfect, ideal, like we had this, you know, made-up image of the West, which was also, you know, very idealistic, so to speak, right? So, and we believed at the time that actually it could go on, though it was, you know, mutilated, disfigured by the Soviet power, I mean, Russian culture, right? But it could go on. And Khadasevich was a great encouragement. I mean, because, as I said, right, he was quite classical, so he had this, you know, he really, as he himself put it, he grafted the classical rose to the Soviet wilding, he said it, right? You remember. So there was this golden age poetry in him, which we adored at the time, right? And this, you know, almost, as I said, postmodernistic, you know, touch. And it was wonderful. And besides, he was, I mean, so precise, you know. Of course, everybody knows this phrase by Coleridge, right? That poetry is the best words in the best order. That's what Khadasevich was for me. When I was really overwhelmed when I read him, right? Okay.
If we focus on Khadasevich in exile, in emigration, you mentioned in your talk that you know, there were some times that he really had trouble making ends meet, but right. Then he got this job as a literary reviewer, and you know, things were brightening up. So he made quite a decent career as a critic, as a journalist in France. But at the same time, he produced some rather grim thoughts about the fate of Russian emigration and what would happen to Russian poetry, to perhaps the Russian language in emigration. So he publishes an article in 1925 about where does the real Russian literature reside? Is that in Russia itself, or is it outside of Russia? And he was quite pessimistic. How do you think? How did he properly assess the situation back then? And do you think there's reason to be as apprehensive about what's going on right now, and what would this do to Russian literature, Russian language?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I honestly, with all my respect to Khadasevich, I think that his assessment was wrong. I don't think that Russian culture and Russian poetry in particular is, you know, limited by geography or geographical position of an author. And we have lots of, you know, proofs of this point, right? We have Khadasevich himself, we have Georgy Ivanov, we have Poplavsky, and the whole, you know, number of great Russian poets and writers who worked outside Russia. Yeah, as well as wonderful poets who worked inside Russia. So what I mean that, you know, of course everybody knows Nabokov, right? And I believe some of you have heard of Shalamov, right? And so my message is that you, I mean, can't turn Nabokov into Shalamov, right? Even if you make them, you know, flop their, you know, places. Well, Nabokov wouldn't have liked that, obviously, but yeah, even you put, you know, Shalamov in Montreux, right? Yeah, he wouldn't have, you know, written Lolita or something. Yes, and so what I mean that when we talk about that, we deal with well, individual destinies or fates, right? Rather than real Russian culture. Well, yeah, I think it is. Well, you never know. Some people will be writing in Kolyma, and some people will be writing in Paris or somewhere in Montreux. So you never know. Okay.
Now, on a related note, again, this is a question about possible historical parallels or false analogies. I don't know. Among immigrants of the first wave, especially in France, but possibly also in Germany, there was a feeling that these immigrants had a sort of a sacred duty to preserve real Russian culture and the real pure Russian language. I think, you know, Ivan Bunin was probably someone who thought along these lines. So what we see in immigrant publications is that they, for instance, for a long time refused to accept the new spelling rules that were adopted in Soviet Russia. And there are a number of other examples that could be adduced. Now, do you but perhaps this is also a question to you, Maxim, I don't know, do you feel the urge to preserve Russian culture? Do you feel a certain responsibility towards the Russian language, towards Russian literature?
Okay.
Is that a...
Okay, I'll tell you what I think about it. You know, first of all, I believe that any, well, you know, national culture, the whole, well, the concept of national culture is more or less artificial construct, which was created in the 18th century, basically, right? And you know what I think? That, well, and I know that for sure, and I believe you know that too, that, well, if you don't, I can briefly tell you that, for example, Russian poetry, well, I mean, what can be more national than national poetry, right? Nothing. Okay? So, and I have to tell you that our national Russian poetry, I mean, wouldn't have been like that without borings and influences. So it started with Polish influence in the 17th century. Then our great scholar, the founder of Russian University, Lomonosov, right, went to Germany, and in the middle of the 18th century, and brought back the meter system of our poetry, which we're still using. I mean, it became the main meter system, right? For us. Then in Pushkin times, of course, there was this French influence. Then in the 20th century, due to, well, partly Nabokov and Brodsky and some just, you know, vers libre, which is being, you know, written now more and more often. I mean, well, of course, it was Anglo-American influence, obviously, right? So, And for me, I can tell you, right, that what is national culture? What is Russian? Well, mainly it's our memory, right, of some books or some paintings or something, right? We learned, we read in childhood. And so, again, my reading was Mark Twain and, Astrid Lindgren and, well, along with Russian authors, of course. But what is, Russian culture? What should we preserve? Of course, I believe that, well, and probably in a way, it's, a responsibility of, a writer to preserve some principles or some traditions he or she thinks are worth preserving, right? But it's an individual, deed. It's not just that we have some, I don't know, this, as I say, construct, which we have to, there is, I doubt that, and of course now, well, you know that too, after what happened, yes, recently, on the 24th of February, of course, we are facing, well, a real problem. I believe we are facing, we have to really reevaluate some things, obviously. I don't mean that every, Dostoevsky is to blame for what happened on the 24th of February. I don't think so. But, of course, when we read even Dostoevsky or somebody else, we can see that there are something, some things we can't agree with today. And so, again, Russian culture is something as, well, I gave you this quote from Khadasevich, right, that develops, that evolves, and is always in progress. So, well, the idea of preservation, is probably wrong from the start. What you shouldn't preserve, you can preserve, apple jam or whatever, right? But not culture. I don't think so. Okay.
Yeah. Maxim, what do you
think? After such a beautiful speech, I don't feel responsible for Russian culture. I don't feel like this, maybe because I do not identify myself as a writer, just I started to write quite late, and I am not responsible for preservation or developing of Russian culture. I am responsible for my family, and this is for sure. And as for culture, Pushkin will remain Pushkin, Tchaikovsky will remain Tchaikovsky, and we will remain who we are, hopefully. So that's what I can tell you.
But the reason I ask is also because, the West is blamed for canceling Russian culture, whereas the bitter irony of it is that so much culture gets cancelled in Russia right now with all these...
Absolutely.
So,
the place where culture is cancelled is Russia.
Yes.
And recently, Evgenia Berkovich, wonderful poet, was put into prison just for writing, of a drama, of making and staging. Actually, staging. She is not the author, and the author also was put into prison. And this is, even in Russia, even now, it is unique case, because they are accused of terrorism, defense of terrorism, whatever, although this acquittance of terrorism, that's the name of this, and this was not the law like that when it was staged, actually. So this is something outrageous.
It's outrageous.
Going on. So the idea why I started a magazine is not to preserve anything, but to give to let writers express themselves and to readers to read poetry and prose, mainly poetry, because there is a really great poetry came up from this war. So as for prose, maybe it comes later. Nobody knows. But prose about the war mainly is written after the war. And since we even do not know when and how this war will end, it is really difficult to write about it. And to write about something else is also very difficult because all our thoughts are there. So this is it.
So we will have to wait a little longer for another War and Peace.
Yes.
Dmitry, returning to Khadasevich, so I talked about his memoirs, you about his poetry. He kind of stopped writing poetry around 1927 or so. Right. And what was the reason for that? Can we put our finger on it? Is it just that he lost his inspiration? It was because he was living outside of Russia. Do we have any information on that, or can we speculate what happened?
Right. Well, I'm afraid even Khadasevich himself couldn't have answered that question, Otto, honestly. Well, I used to have some ideas, some theories, but one of them, I can just again very briefly tell you that Khadasevich was one of those who felt the time very well and the atmosphere and everything, and probably it was my theory. Maybe it's just nonsense, but some time ago I really thought that he kind of felt what was going to happen. He was following it quite closely, I mean, the political situation as well. And he was really feeling what it was going to happen, and in a way he fulfilled what, of course, this famous phrase by Adorno that it's impossible to write, or you shouldn't write poetry after Auschwitz, right? So, and by the way, the fourth wife of Khadasevich, Olga Margolina, was arrested and killed after his death, of course, when Paris was occupied by Nazis. She was killed in a Nazi death camp. And so I had, as I say, this kind of vision that maybe Khadasevich really felt that it was impossible to write poetry, that it was wrong. But actually, I'm not sure, of course, of that. What I think that it was, in my opinion, it was just a period of silence before a new period of poetry. Because, after all, he wrote at least two very good poems in this last period, right? One is in memory of his cat Moore, wonderful poem. And the second poem, I mean, was written just 1 year before he died. It's Iambic Tetrameter, very good poem. Oh, yes. Okay, so, but this period was abruptly cut off by his death.
Yes. Okay. I think we have to leave it at that.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
I think we have to leave it at that since we are running out of time. Yeah. And before I announce the last event, the last three pieces of music that Mikhail Murach again will perform, I want to say that our next event will happen on the 3rd of June, and it will be Livona Kapyan will come from Russia. He's a very famous scholar on Shostakovich, and he wrote several books in English dedicated to Shostakovich's work, and he will have a lecture on Shostakovich, and Elliott Quartet will perform Shostakovich Quartet number 3, and it will happen on June 3rd. So at 1:30 it will be a day concert. It will start at 1:30 p.m. So please come and bring your friends who love music. And Mikhail now will play one piece of Tchaikovsky from Opus 37, bis from Four Seasons, October, and 2 pieces of Prokofiev, Dance of Girls of Antilles from Romeo and Juliet, and Adagio from Cinderella. Please.
Thank